Hey guys, it's Godbars here, the self-proclaimed hip-hop historian, and this is the 20th episode of my series where I grab a vinyl from my collection, talk about why I love it, what influence it has, and what its place is in the grand scheme of hip-hop. So if you've been keeping up with my channel, you'll know that this is the last video that I'm doing of this group of 10 that's all modern albums. Then I'm gonna move on to 5 albums from the 80s, and then 10 from the 2000s, then the 90s, and loop back around. So don't think any album I don't talk about in any of these given eras is an album I don't love or consider a classic. While it came down to choosing which last album to share out of this modern bunch, I chose the first album in the Saturation series by now defunct group Brockhampton because I feel like it checks a completely different set of boxes from any of the other albums I've talked about so far. While in the last few years, Brockhampton has become a much bigger name and amassed a pretty sizable fan base, when this album came out and I first went to check it out, I had never even heard the name Brockhampton, and it took a little while for people to take notice and get tuned in with what the boy band was doing. By the time the second Saturation rolled around that same year, there were way more fans than the first album debuted for, and by the end of the year when they released their final installment in the series, they had a massive cult following. While all 3 albums in the Saturation series are frankly stellar, and even some of their later output like Ginger are well worth your listening time, for me, the first Saturation album is the closest the guys ever got to a perfect album, and it's practically as close as you can feasibly get for my sensibilities. I actually technically was familiar with the group before I even knew I was, because years before this album came out, I saw lead founding member Kevin Abstract at Tyler the Creator's Camp Flog Gnaw Festival, and even though I didn't know who he was at the time, I have a vivid memory of him performing his solo song Blink, since it was unlike anything I'd ever heard, especially with how open and unapologetic he was about his sexuality. I think I actually still have a video somewhere in my phone of that concert. I've often been annoyed watching reactions to songs off this album on YouTube, because when they inevitably react to a line where Kevin raps about giving or getting a blowjob, they stop it and go, "Whoa, I'm fine if you want to be gay, but that's just way too much information. Why does he need to say that?" It's incredibly hypocritical considering the thousands of lines of straight rappers talking about a girl doing these exact same acts to them, and then these same people don't say it's too much information. But God forbid a gay rapper wants to give that same representation for his community, especially when these lines are always either hilarious or frankly just fire. Obviously, this provides a really refreshing and unique point of view to the boy band, and it enables Kevin to be vulnerable and discuss discrimination and homophobia he's faced growing up that continues even today in his life, just in different forms. But obviously, Kevin has a lot more to his personality than just being gay. He's an insanely talented singer, songwriter, and I also think he's one of, if not the best lyricists in the whole crew. Speaking of the whole crew, if you aren't familiar with the roster that makes up this collective, or boy band as they coined it, outside of Kevin, they were comprised of Matt Champion, Merlin Wood, Dom McLennan, Joba, Bareface, and a myriad of producers, designers, and managers. Also at this point, Amir Vaughn was in the group, who would later be dropped for controversial allegations, but since this was prior to that and he's such an essential part of this album, I don't think it's necessarily that relevant for the purpose of this video. It's a difficult thing with guys like Kanye because as someone who loves the first 3 albums, so much I got a tattoo for them back before Kanye had actually said any of these insane things. I value and love those first 3, 4, 5 albums as much as anyone does, but I also have a Jewish father, and I really don't feel comfortable currently supporting him in his new endeavors. But since Kanye wasn't that person when he released The College Dropout, I try my best to separate that experience from his recent transgressions. I don't think it's ever easy with any comedian, artist, or actor whose work you enjoy but who ends up doing or saying things you don't support. I probably wouldn't purchase any new Amir Vaughn material, but at the same time, I'm not going to just negate his contribution to the first 3 albums, because I almost feel like it's disrespectful to the other members to let one member's personal decisions nullify an entire classic piece of art. For what it's worth, on this album, Amir has a lot of killer verses. His deep, intimidating voice lends itself to the more aggressive songs, as well as the more personal, emotional ones. This was another one of those albums, sort of like Black Up by Shabazz Palaces, where I can remember the first time I heard either one because both just blew my mind in different ways. It's why my love for the first Saturation is a bit unfair, because as excited as I was for the highly anticipated second and third in the series, while they still cover new territory, I obviously wasn't able to go into those albums with the complete fresh slate I did when I put this album on for the first time. At that point, the boy band, as they called themselves, had barely just had the Viceland video sort of breaking the group down, and while they were definitely turning heads, there would be way more eyes on the later installments compared to the first one. I think the way they were able to release three amazing albums in one year is by all of the members living in the same house in LA and seeming to just be working non-stop at this time. They actually had initially all met on an Odd Future chat room forum thing back in the day, and I think it's such a cool fitting tidbit since, as I mentioned before, my first exposure to anyone from the group was Kevin Abstract at Camp Flogna. In the last handful of years, it's become a lot more popular to release high volumes of music. Guys like Conway the Machine and West Side Gun from Griselda were releasing multiple albums every year at one point, and dudes like Rock Marciano or Huss Kingpin pretty much never have a year go by without output getting released. Of course, there's still plenty of rappers who've released multiple mixtapes in one year, and famously DMX debuted with two classic albums the same year in '98. But for me, at least, when I heard the first Saturation and learned they were going to release the rest of the trilogy all in that year, I was blown away and wasn't even positive they'd be able to do it. Again, I think it's one thing to just have like a playlist of 100 free YouTube beats that make like 5 projects in one year that are all 30 minutes long and sound the same. But that is not the case here at all. All three of the albums undoubtedly sound like they belong in the Saturation series, but you can still play any song off these albums for any given Brockhampton fan, and they more than likely will be able to tell you which of the three it came from. While 2 and 3 have always come off to me as Brockhampton taking the formula they showed off in the original and repeating it with enhancements, the first album has this mysterious, almost tension that it gives me while listening, and it's hard to put my finger on, but it's this mesmerizing quality that really can only come from something totally unique and new. This album was actually a bit challenging for me at first in certain aspects, which isn't to say there were songs I flat out didn't enjoy or found annoying, but there's plenty of experimental moments and choices that grew on me over time, but it took some getting used to. One example of this is how the vocals at times will be pitched up or down to make a completely new voice that makes it near impossible to know which member is rapping if you aren't already extremely familiar with them. While the first couple times I listened, I may have found these pitch shifts and the use of autotune a little jarring. It's probably the main aspect that's turned some hip-hop fans off from this album, but personally I feel like they use these methods in an artistic way that enhances the overall experience. While there's definitely albums in hip-hop I've enjoyed that feature autotune, like Rappa Turned Singa or Rodeo, and despite T-Pain absolutely pioneering the way autotune is used currently in music, for me Saturation was the first album that really made me realize how creatively you can use autotune in hip-hop. While Travis Scott on Rodeo uses autotune in the more traditional sense, where he's cleaning up his vocals and drenching them in reverb and effects to fit these expertly crafted pop songs, the boys in BH flip pop on its head by going from old school, more grimy cypher tracks to using the pitch shift and or autotune on verses and hooks to give them personality. The autotune isn't being used to mask a lack of singing ability. Most of the time it's being used on sections of rapping, and then when you do have a melodic song like Waste, which finishes the album off and only features singing from Bareface, the autotune completely takes a back seat for Bareface to show what a talented instrumentalist and vocalist he is. It's a risky decision that in my opinion paid off, because this group already had so many members and colorful personalities, you could argue they really didn't need the pitched vocals, but personally this album completely changed how I looked at autotune and pitch shifting in relation to hip-hop. Like I said, while I enjoyed albums like Rodeo for what they were still definitely pop albums that were really well executed, but definitely geared for the radio regardless. However, Brockhampton wasn't making anything for the radio at all. They seemed really dedicated to making sure this progressive, forward-thinking project featured plenty of bars and nods to their idols, but it's also unapologetically modern and catchy. I was so blown away by how these guys all got on the same page for every song, no matter what the topic or style. The first song on the album is the hardest, most noisy and eruptive beat on the entire thing, and pretty much everyone who raps on this song uses their grimiest and most in-your-face verse. And just a couple of my favorite moments are when Dom says, "I hate the way I think. I hate the way it looms. I hate the way the things I say incinerate a room. I know I'm trying to change, but it'll never work. Just end up more broken down than when I started, and the concrete feels the hardest every time I start to touch it. Started thinking I am meant for life. But that's too deep, falling up into the ceiling while I'm drowning in the creek of my emotions, trying harder to be open." The other standout moment I have to mention is where Joba delivers the bone-chilling line, "Fuck you, I'll break your neck so you can watch your back," over and over. This is one of the best ways to start an album I can think of, and they completely offset whatever expectations you might have gone into the album with, having heard them refer to their crew as a boy band. They go right from the speaker-knocking intro to Gold, which is one of the catchiest hooks the group has ever put together, and it's a perfect 180 displaying how 2 tracks in, they already have a good amount of area covered. By the end of track 3, Star, if you're like me, you'll be totally sold on this thing and ready to hear more. Star has the various members each fill their respective verses with references to and wordplay involving various celebrities or stars. This setup gives each MC a chance to stick to a theme and have fun doing it, as well as showing their various influences. This track also has a killer beat, and from this point they implement the pitch shifting, skits, and song topics like love, self-identity, and trying to find yourself as an artist. You may have noticed all the songs I've named have 4 letters outside of Waste, and that's because every song on Saturation has 4 letters, then the very last one has 5, foreshadowing how Saturation 2 has songs with all 5 letter names, then the last one on there has 6, so on and so forth. Honestly, I don't exactly know what the deeper meaning is, if it has any. I may be wrong, but I always just sort of looked at it like an aesthetic choice. But it could also just be building onto that commentary about the market being oversaturated. All of these song titles are capitalized as well, and it ends in a cool kind of loop since the third installment features songs with all 6 letters, with the exception of the final song in the entire series, which only has 4, making that kind of full circle back to the first album. Overall, this is easily one of my favorite albums of the last 10 years. For my money, there really isn't a more diverse and experimental album in modern hip-hop that's this catchy, full of personality, and dope, strongly written and delivered verses. For Saturation, I think my 3 favorite songs would have to be Heat, Star, and Face, but I wanted to give a couple honorable mentions in the form of Fake and Waste. Thank you for watching my 20th video. As I mentioned at the beginning, next time I'm going to move on to 5 classic albums from the Golden Age or the 80s, so definitely tune in if you want to see what I'm going to start off that decade with. I'm also kind of putting my rule of not discussing really obvious famous classics on the back burner for a bit, because now that I've covered a decent amount of underground and personal favorite albums, I feel like I can kind of step back and do some of those more obvious ones just to kind of set a base. Besides, I feel like as famous as a lot of these classics are that everyone's heard of a million times, I think some of them are kind of like Thriller or Sgt. Pepper, where I think they're just so famous that a lot of younger kids just never even really consider to go listen to it. So that's why I want to knock out at least a few of the really essential ones, and then I'll get back to slightly more underground stuff. So be sure to tune in next time to see what old school album I'm going to talk about. Also like, subscribe, and let me know what your favorite songs off of this alternative landmark are. Don't forget to have a great day, and I'll see you next time, okay? Alright.